Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to Guys at Magic. This is Hunter coming at you with another deck tech for the channel. That is right. We're doing a deck tech. We're talking about every single card in this deck I've made. As always, we always kind of keep it around $300 to $400 in that range. We give ourselves that kind of budget. But if you wanted to go bigger, go bigger. If you wanted to go smaller, go smaller. This is just my build. But the card we are talking about today is brand new from Assassin's Creed. That's right, new legendary creatures, specifically a real-life character. That's right, it's Cleopatra. So let's go ahead, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel if you haven't done so already so you're staying up to date with everything, and let's kick it off with this deck tech. So like I said, we are doing Cleopatra. It is Cleopatra Exiled Pharaoh. It's 2 black and a green for a 2/4 legendary creature human noble. It's got allies, which means at the beginning of your end step, put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 other target legendary creatures. It also has betrayal, which means whenever a legendary creature with counters on it dies, draw a card for each counter on it, you lose 2 life. Now, as you guys know, if you've been watching this channel long enough, I'm always the +1/+1 counter guy. I don't know why, but it always happens that way. And this is right up my alley. We're doing something a little different though, because we're going Golgari. So it's very cool in the fact that our commander can allow us to draw cards whenever we want. And if we are playing against other people's counter strategies, it doesn't say whenever a legendary creature that we control dies. So if their creature had a bunch of +1/+1 counters on it and we killed it, guess what? We're drawing that many cards for that many counters, however many were on our opponent's stuff. It's fantastic. Card draw wins games. I say it all the time. So let's go ahead and get started with this deck. I want to start it off with a Planeswalker. I'm only adding 1 Planeswalker into this deck. That's all I think it needs, really. And it's my favorite Planeswalker when it comes to a +1/+1 counter strategy. That we've seen in a long time, but because we are Golgari, I'm excited to run it because it's in black. It's Vraska's Betrayal Sting. It's 4 black and a Phyrexian black, meaning you could either pay black or 2 life. It has a starting loyalty of 6. It is completed, which means, like I said, you can either pay with 2 life or you can pay with a black. If it was paid with life, it enters with 2 fewer loyalty counters. So if you did pay for a black and 2 life, it comes in with a starting loyalty of 4. But as of right now, starting loyalty is 6. It has a 0 ability, which is fantastic, which means you draw a card, you lose a life, and you proliferate. So we can proliferate all of our +1/+1 counters. We have maybe some other type of counters we'll get to later down the road here we can also add on to. And we can obviously add a counter here on our loyalty ability. So just imagine this as like a +1, really. As a -2, it says target creature becomes a treasure artifact and loses all other card types and abilities. Just removal on a stick right there. Instead of removing their commander, it's now just a treasure. -9, it's ultimate. It says if target player has fewer than 9 poison counters, they get a number of poison counters equal to the difference. So immediately just give someone 9 poison counters if they had no poison counters. And then if we can make it back to our turn, proliferate, they're dead. It's a pretty mean ultimate, but Vraska really is all about that proliferate, and that's what we want to do. We want to make our creatures as big as possible, and if they do die, we get to draw that many cards. Now it's time for the bulk of our deck. That is right, we are going straight into the creatures, but first and foremost, we gotta make mana somehow. So these first couple of creatures are all about producing mana. We have Birds of Paradise for 1 green. It's a 0/1 with a flyer. You can tap to add 1 mana of any color. Everybody knows this card. Tap, get some mana. Either black or green. Who cares? Delighted Halfling is great in this deck because we are a legendary creature matter deck. So it is 1 green for a 1/2 creature halfling citizen. You can tap to add colors, or you can tap to add 1 mana of any color. Spend this mana only to cast a legendary spell, and that spell can't be countered. So this is an all-star in this deck because we are running so many legendary creatures. We're just going to make them uncounterable. Rishkar, Pima Renegade, is 2 and a green for a 2/2 legendary creature elf druid. It says when it enters the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures. And then it also says each creature you control with a counter on it has tap to add a green. So depending on how many counters we have already on our board with our creatures, now they all become mana dorks. It's fantastic. Moving on to the final non-legendary creatures that just kind of help this deck run before we get into the bulk of our legendary creatures. First up, Evolution Sage, 2 and a green for a 3/2 creature elf druid. Got landfall that says whenever a land enters the battlefield, proliferate. That's what we want to do. We're just bumping up those counters more and more and more. Forgotten Ancient is 3 and a green for a 0/3 creature elemental. It says whenever a player casts a spell, you put a counter on Forgotten Ancient. It also says at the beginning of your upkeep, you may move any number of +1/+1 counters from Forgotten Ancient onto other creatures. This is an all-star, really, in EDH because it's whenever a player. So you put this down on your turn, and then the board just goes, and then your opponents start casting spells. We just start ticking up Forgotten Ancient over and over and over, and then at your upkeep, you can distribute those counters to your other creatures. It's great. Winding Constrictor is a black and a green for a 2/3 creature snake. It says if one or more counters would be put on an artifact or creature you control, that many +1 of each of those kinds of counters are put on that permanent instead. It also says if you would get one or more counters, you get that many +1 of each of those kinds of counters instead. So, yeah, we're just getting more counters. And here we go. We're going to be talking about the legendary creatures from now on for the creature department. First up, we're going to talk about more card draw. Yes, our commander does a lot in that department. We are going to be drawing a ton of cards, but I've said it before, card draw wins games, and these creatures do that as well. So, I know this first one doesn't actually just say card draw, it does a little bit more, but I'm putting it in this section anyways. It's Glissa Sunslayer, 1 black green for a 3/3 legendary creature, Phyrexian zombie. It's got first strike and it's got death touch, and it says whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you can choose one. You can draw a card, lose a life, which is fantastic. You can destroy target enchantment, or you can remove up to 3 counters from target permanent. So, the pesky opponent has a Planeswalker that is pretty low on counters. Remove those, and now the Planeswalker's just dead. But like I said, this is a great card draw as well, because people aren't trying to block a first strike death toucher. They die so quickly. Legolas Greenleaf is coming in here, 2 and a green for a 2/2 legendary creature elf archer. It's got reach, and it says it can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. It also says whenever another legendary creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on Legolas Greenleaf. And whenever Legolas Greenleaf deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card. The synergies here, do you see it? When we're casting our legendary creatures, we're growing Legolas. Legolas is going to deal some damage and draw his cards. Riki, the History of Kamigawa, is 2 and a green for a 1/2 legendary creature human shaman. It says whenever you play a legendary spell, draw a card. Yes, please. And finally, Toski, Barrier of Secrets, is here as well. It is 3 and a green for a 1/1 legendary creature squirrel. It says this spell can't be countered. It's got indestructible. It says it has to attack each turn if able. And whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. Toski, I feel like every time I play green and I'm looking for a really good card draw outlet, most of the time Toski is going in the deck. Every time. Okay, so we are a +1/+1 counter deck. It's time to move on to those legendary creatures that actually help with this kind of style. First up, another Lord of the Rings card. That's right, it is Arwen, Weaver of Hope. It's 1 and 2 green for a 2/1 legendary creature elf noble. It says each other creature you control enters the battlefield with a number of additional +1/+1 counters on it equal to Arwen, Weaver of Hope's toughness. So the bigger this gets, the bigger our creatures are going to get entering the battlefield. Bristly Bill, Spine Sower, is 1 and a green for a 2/2 legendary creature plant druid. It's got landfall that says whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. And another ability could be 3 and 2 green to double the number of +1/+1 counters on each creature you control. Yes, please. And Draina, Liberator of Malakir, is 1 and 2 black for a 2/3 legendary creature vampire ally. It's got flying and first strike and says whenever Draina deals combat damage to a player, put a +1/+1 counter on each attacking creature you control. And you might be thinking to yourself, what's the point of that? Well, so when Draina attacks, it's going to hit that opponent first, and then it triggers, gives all of our other attacking creatures another +1/+1 counter. They just get bigger and deal damage after Draina. Moving on, we have Renata, Called to the Hunt, 2/2 green for a star 3 legendary enchantment creature, Demigod. It says its power is equal to your devotion to green. And it also says each other creature you control enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. Surak and Goreclaw is 4 and 2 green for a 6/5 legendary creature human bear. It's got trample. It says other creatures you control have trample. And whenever another non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on it. It gains haste until end of turn. So Surak and Goreclaw making our things bigger with those counters and also being able to just get in for damage, giving everything trample. So good. Emissary Green is 4 and a green for a 3/3 legendary creature human advisor. It says whenever it attacks, starting with you, each player votes profit or security. You create a number of treasure tokens equal to twice the number of profit votes, and put a number of +1/+1 counters on each creature you control equal to the number of security votes. Emissary Green is fantastic here. It really gives the flexibility of it doesn't matter what our opponent chooses because treasure is fantastic and we just want as many counters as possible. So great include. Moving on to some more legendary creatures that care about counters, except they're a bit more selfish. First up is Slurk, all ingesting. It's 5 and a green for a 0/0 legendary creature Ooze. It says it enters the battlefield with 5 +1/+1 counters on it. It also says whenever Slurk or another creature you control dies, if it had a +1/+1 counter on it, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control that has a +1/+1 counter on it. So Slurk isn't as selfish as I had kind of alluded to here, but the fantastic ability here is if our commander's on the battlefield and something with a counter on it dies, we draw that many cards for however many counters is on it, and Slurk says, you know what? I'm going to add a counter to everything else that didn't die. It's really good. Grokma, Skyclave Ravager, is 1 a black and a green for a 0/0 legendary creature Hydra Horror. It says it enters the battlefield with 3 +1/+1 counters on it, and whenever another creature you control dies, if it had a +1/+1 counter on it, put a +1/+1 counter on Grokma. And then whenever Grokma dies, create an XX black and green Hydra creature token where X is the number of +1/+1 counters on Grokma. So essentially, it just replaces itself. If it died when it had counters on it, you're making that 0/0, whatever many counters you had it. So it's a great replacement effect, and it gets bigger if our other things die that had counters on it as well. It's good here. Kerbis, Harvest Celebrant, is X and 2 green for a 0/0 legendary creature Treefolk. It says it enters the battlefield with a number of +1/+1 counters on it equal to the amount of mana spent to cast it. So if you just cast it for just the 2 green, it comes in with 2 counters. And then it says remove a +1/+1 counter from Kerbis. Prevent all damage that would be dealt this turn to another target creature with a +1/+1 counter on it. So if we are in a commanding state and we have a really big creature with a bunch of counters on it, maybe we don't want it to die anymore. So Kerbis is a great way to just kind of defend that. Lilybowen Raging Grandma is going to be 3 and a green for a 0/0 legendary creature Mutant Warrior. It's got Vigilance, and it says it enters the battlefield with 2 +1/+1 counters on it. And then at the beginning of your upkeep, double the number of +1/+1 counters on Lilybowen if its power is 16 or less. Otherwise, remove all but 1 +1/+1 counter from it. Then you gain 1 life for each +1/+1 counter removed this way. So Lilybowen is going to grow, and then shrink back down, but you gain a bunch of life. So it's really fun. It's got Vigilance, so it can also protect us if we're on block duty. It's a really good card here. Polukranos Unchained is 2 a black and a green for a 0/0 legendary creature Zombie Hydra. It says it enters the battlefield with 6 +1/+1 counters on it. It escapes with 12 +1/+1 counters on it instead. If damage would be dealt to Polukranos while it has a +1/+1 counter on it, prevent that damage and remove that many +1/+1 counters from it. It also has another ability to pay 1 a black and a green for Polukranos fighting another target creature. And then it's got an escape cost for 4 a black and a green. Exile 6 other cards from your graveyard. It is so good here. It just never goes away. As long as our graveyard is full, we just kind of keep bringing Polukranos back. It's that 12/12 swinging in. It's mean. Rayhan, Last of the Abzan, is 1 a black and a green for a 0/0 legendary creature Human Warrior. It says it enters the battlefield with 3 +1/+1 counters on it. It also says whenever a creature you control dies or is put into the command zone, if it had 1 or more +1/+1 counters on it, you may put that many +1/+1 counters on target creature. So very similar effect that we've been seeing here over and over. Basically, our counters just don't go away. If something dies that had counters on it, put it on something else. Skullbriar, the Walking Grave, is a black and a green for a 1/1 legendary creature zombie elemental. It's got haste, and it says, whenever Skullbriar, the Walking Grave, deals combat damage to a player, put a +1/+1 counter on it. It also says counters remain on Skullbriar as it moves from any zone other than player's hand or library. So if Skullbriar dies, those counters stay there. We have ways to reanimate, so we're going to bring it back. It's not going to go anywhere. It's going to come back with all those counters. It's going to be fantastic. It's got haste. It can swing in right away. Yeah, count me in. And also, Yeheni, Undying Partisan, is 2 and a black for a 2/2 legendary creature, Aetherborn Vampire. It's got haste, and it says whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, put a +1/+1 counter on Yeheni, Undying Partisan. It also says you can sacrifice another creature. Yeheni gains indestructible until end of turn. So the fantastic thing about Yeheni here is, if our opponent's stuff is dying, Yeheni's getting bigger, but it's got that sack outlet. So if we really need to draw cards, sack something that's on our side with a bunch of +1/+1 counters on it. Cleopatra will see that, draws a bunch of cards for however many counters. And finally, let's move on to some utility creatures that are in this deck as well. Starting with Agent Frank Horrigan. It's 5 and a black and a green for a 8/6 legendary creature, Mutant Warrior. It's got trample. It has indestructible as long as it attacked this turn. And it says whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, you proliferate twice. Do it 2 times. It's really good. Fane the Broker, 2 and a black for a 3/3 legendary creature, Human Warlock. Has an ability, you can tap it, sacrifice a creature, put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature. You can tap it, remove a counter from a creature you control to create a treasure token. You can tap it, sacrifice an artifact, create a 2/1 white and black Inkling creature token with flying, or pay 3 and a black, untap Fane the Broker. Does a lot here, does a lot for our deck. Count me in. It gives that sacrifice outlet so we can draw a bunch of cards. We're also putting counters on it. Fane the Broker in Cleopatra, it's like a must. Honest Rutstein is 1 a black and a green for a 3/2 legendary creature, Human Warlock. It says when it enters the battlefield, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. It also says creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. So if we had something that was really important to us die, bring it back to your hand. And also, all of our creatures now cost 1 less. It's just Honest Rutstein. Good include here. Finally, these last 2 creatures, Kadama of the West Tree, 2 and a green for a 3/3 legendary creature, Spirit. It's got reach. It says modified creatures you control have trample, which, by the way, if it has a +1/+1 counter, it's considered modified. It also says whenever a modified creature you control deals combat damage to a player, search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. Another way just to go ahead and ramp. And finally, Marin of Clan Nel Toth, 2 black, green for a 3/4 legendary creature, Human Shaman. It says whenever another creature you control dies, you get an experience counter. And at the beginning of your end step, choose target creature card in your graveyard. If that card's converted mana cost is less than or equal to the number of experience counters you have, return it to the battlefield. Otherwise, put it in your hand. I've been talking about this other counter that we might have in the deck, and here it is. We have experience counters. So a lot of these cards in this deck that proliferate can also proliferate our experience counters. If Marin of Clan Nel Toth is on the field and we're sacking, let's say, Skullbriar, guess what? At the end step, we can go ahead and put Skullbriar right back because that doesn't lose any counters. It's fantastic. Time to move on to the sorcery department. What's a sorcery card if you're not trying to ramp? Am I right? We're in green. We got a ramp. So this first couple of cards, all ramp pieces. Cultivate, 2 and a green for sorcery. Search your library for up to 2 basic land cards. Reveal them, put 1 on the battlefield tab, the other in your hand. Shuffle. Farseek, 1 and a green for sorcery. Search your library for a plains, island, swamp, or mountain. Put it onto the battlefield tab, then shuffle. Nature's Lore, 1 and a green. Sorcery. Search your library for a forest. Put that on the battlefield, then shuffle. Rampant Growth, 1 and a green. Sorcery. Search your library for a basic land. Put it on the battlefield, tapped, shuffle. 3 visits, 1 and a green. Sorcery. Search your library for a forest. Put it onto the battlefield. Doesn't say tapped. Then shuffle your library. So, yeah. Y'all know what these cards do. We're ramping. Ramp with me. Also, we're throwing in some board wipes here. These are my 2 favorites. We have Damnation, 2 and 2 black. Sorcery. Destroy all creatures. They can't be regenerated. And Toxic Deluge, 2 and a black sorcery. As an additional cost to cast this spell, pay X life. All creatures get -X until end of turn. So the fantastic thing about adding these in a deck like Cleopatra is if we do have creatures that have a bunch of +1/+1 counters on it, we're going to be drawing a bunch of cards because it didn't say anything about power or toughness when they die. So Toxic Deluge, if we're wiping our own board, that's fine. The counters stay even though it has 0 health, so we're going to be still drawing cards. And the final sorcery I am throwing in here is an alternate win con if we are having a ton of mana at the end of the game. This is a card I always add here in black. Torment of Hailfire, X and 2 black for a sorcery. It says repeat the following process X times. Each opponent loses 3 life unless that player sacrifices a non-land permanent or discards a card. So let's say that the X cost is 10. Let's say our opponent just keeps saying Emissary Green, they just kept going profits, and we have a whole bunch of treasure. So guess what? That's 11 times if the X cost is 10, because you're doing it 10 more times after the first time. So 33 damage to everybody. Unless they start destroying things, that's pretty much a victory there. It's always going to be an endgame piece. Time to move on to the instant department. That's right. We're doing things a little bit quicker. This first category is removal, because of course we need removal. The first card is obviously Assassin's Trophy. We're in the colors, right? So black and a green for an instant says destroy target permanent and opponent controls. Its controller may search their library for a basic land card and put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle. That's fine. Just destroy their best piece. You can also go after lands if you really wanted to. Atomize is 2, a black and a green for an instant that says destroy target non-land permanent and proliferate. That works out in our favor. Beast Within, 2 and a green instant, destroy target permanent. Its controller creates a 3/3 green beast creature token. And Infernal Grasp, 1 and a black for an instant, destroy target creature, you'll lose 2 life. Worst case scenario besides Assassin's Trophy, we can target our own stuff to start drawing a bunch of cards depending on how many counters are on that card we're destroying. So, like I said, that's absolutely worst case scenario. Otherwise, we're just destroying a bunch of stuff here. Moving on to what I like to call the combat trick department. We do have a little bit of combat tricks. This first one is Feign Death. 1 black for an instant. Until end of turn, target creature gains. When this creature dies, return to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control with a +1/+1 counter on it. So if our opponent tried to destroy one of our favorite things, that's cool. We'll draw all the cards, however many counters are on it, but it's going to come back with a counter on it. So count me in. Gift of the Viper, very cool new combat trick from Modern Horizons 3, is 1 green for an instant, put a +1/+1 counter, a reach counter, and a death touch counter on target creature, untap it. So does it look like our board has been tapped down? Surprise, Gift of the Viper. And finally, Revitalizing Repast is a hybrid black or green. For an instant, it put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. It gains indestructible until end of turn. So not only does this give us a counter, also keeps that creature from dying if we really needed to. You can also play this on the backside, which is a land that can tap for a black or green, but it always enters battlefield tapped. So if you're missing out on lands, this is a great MDFC card. In the last instance here are a bit of protection, because if we're winning the game, we don't need to draw any more cards. We're just trying to protect the win here. So Heroic Intervention, 1 and a green for an instant. Permanents you control gain hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. Inspiring Call is 2 and a green for an instant. Draw a card for each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it. Those creatures gain indestructible until end of turn. So not only is this a protection spell, but it also draws us a bunch of cards. Silk Guard, X and a green for an instant. Put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to X target creatures you control. Auras, equipment, and modified creatures you control gain hexproof until end of turn. So protect the board. That's the name of the game. Protect the win. All right, moving right into the artifact department. We are heavy with some mana rocks here, because what's better than mana rocks? We want to do stuff with our mana, right? So Arcane Signet, Felwar Stone, and Soul Ring are coming in here. If you didn't already know, Arcane Signet can tap for any mana of any color in your commander's color identities, or black or green. Felwar Stone, a little different, add 1 mana of any color that a land an opponent could produce. So even if they didn't have the colors that we needed, you can still use it for generic mana as well. Soul Ring, 1 mana, tap it, add 2 colorless mana. Everyone knows this. This is in every commander staple product. Put it in every deck you got. Continuing on, you've got Talisman of Resilience, 2 mana for an artifact. You tap to add a color, so you can also tap to add a black or green. It deals 1 damage to you. Thought Vessel is 2 generic. You can tap it to add a colorless, and you have no maximum hand size, because that's going to be important, because we are going to be drawing so many cards. So what better way is to not discard any of them, right? Relic of Legends is going to be 3 generic mana for an artifact. You can tap to add 1 mana of any color. It also says you can tap an untapped legendary creature you control, add 1 mana of any color. So because we are a legendary creature heavy deck, Relic of Legends here is so good. And finally, the Great Henge, which is my personal favorite mana rock, and I wish this would be reprinted into Oblivion so it's cheap enough to continue at least put in every single deck I own. It's 7 and 2 green for a legendary artifact. It says the spell costs X less to cast, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. You can tap it to add 2 green mana. You also gain 2 life. And whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on it and draw a card. The Great Henge is the Great Henge for a reason. It is great. So good. It does so many things here. We did add some equipment into this deck that I felt like was very important here. First up, Andril, Narcel Reforged. I am butchering that, I already know. It's 2 generic mana for a legendary artifact equipment. It has Ascend. It also says whenever equipped creature attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. If you have the city's blessing, put 2 +1/+1 counters on each creature you control instead of equip cost of 3. Yeah, so this is a really good equipment for +1/+1 counter deck. We're going to be putting on so many. Swiftfoot Boots I'm throwing in as well. 2 mana for an artifact equipment. It says equipped creature has hexproof and haste. Equip cost of 1. Yeah, just throw this on Cleopatra and just sit back, because Cleopatra is going to be the way to win this game. We're going to be drawing a bunch of cards. But we can also move it over in the case that our creature that just came in with a whole bunch of counters, Polukranos, move that over to Polukranos and now swing it as a 12/12 with haste. It's pretty good. Power Fist, 1 and a green for an artifact equipment. It says equipped creature has trample, and whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, put that many +1/+1 counters on it. Equip cost is 2. So Power Fist is powerful. We are going to do a lot of damage and then make our creature bigger. And our final 2 artifacts, ironically, they care about counters, but more ironically, it's the same. They're both the Ozolith. It's Ozolith, the Shattered Spire, 1 and a green for a legendary artifact. It says if 1 or more +1/+1 counters would be put on an artifact or creature you control, that many +1/+1 counters are put on it instead. Another ability, you could pay 1 and a green, tap it, put a +1/+1 counter on target artifact or creature you control, activate only as a sorcery. It also has a cycling cost of 2 if you didn't need this, if it was a draw way down the line. And of course, the OG, the Ozolith itself, is just 1 mana. Legendary artifact. It says whenever a creature you control leaves the battlefield, if it had counters on it, put those counters on the Ozolith. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if the Ozolith has counters on it, you may move all counters from it onto target creature. So imagine that we ended up using Gift of the Viper and that creature died. It's going to leave with the Death Touch counter, with the +1/+1 counter, however many there are, with the reach counter. It's going to go over to the Ozolith. Ozolith's going to take all those counters, put it onto something else. It's really good. Moving on to our enchantments. That's right, one more thing to talk about before we get to our lands. Branching Evolution, 2 and a green for an enchantment that says if 1 or more +1/+1 counters would be put on a creature you control, twice that many +1/+1 counters are put on it instead. Also, Hardened Scales is here too. 1 green mana for an enchantment. It says if 1 or more +1/+1 counters would be put on a creature you control, put that many +1/+1 counters on it instead. My favorite enchantment ever since it's been printed, because I am the +1/+1 counter guy, it's Court of Garenbrig. Of course it's here. 1 and 2 green enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, you become the Monarch. So not only is that you get some card draw if you're still the Monarch. At the beginning of your upkeep, distribute 2 +1/+1 counters among up to 2 target creatures. Then, if you're the Monarch, double the number of +1/+1 counters on each creature you control. Yeah, let's do it. And finally, the last kind of counter matters enchantment here is Master Chef. It's 2 and a green, legendary enchantment background. It says, commander creatures you own have this creature enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. And other creatures you control enter the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counters on them. So, as long as our commander Cleopatra is on the field, we're just going to be increasing the counters again. Our final 2 enchantments here are just kind of really good. So I'm just throwing them. These are my others. This is the others enchantments. Garruk's Uprising is 2 and a green for an enchantment that says when it enters the battlefield, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, draw a card. Creatures you control have trample. And whenever a creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. So more card draw, more card draw. Swing in for damage with that trample as well. Just keep it going. Vraska Joins Up is black and a green for a legendary enchantment that says whenever it enters the battlefield, put a death touch counter on each creature you control. And whenever a legendary creature you control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. Card draw wins games, everybody. Just keep drawing cards. And finally, let's talk about the lands. We'll start with some of the utility ones. Karn's Bastion is here. It is a land you can tap for a colorless. You can also pay 4, tap it to proliferate. That is right. Pump up those counters if we don't have anything else to do with our mana. Phyrexian Tower is in this deck as well. It's a legendary land. You can tap it to add a colorless. You can also tap it, sacrifice a creature to add 2 colorless mana. So Phyrexian Tower is so good here because we have another sack outlet, this time on a land. Sack something with a bunch of counters, make 2 mana, draw a bunch of cards, use that mana to use whatever you just drew. Plaza of Heroes is a must-need in this deck because we're playing with legendary creatures. So it's a land, you can tap it to add a colorless. You can also tap it to add 1 mana of any color. Spend this mana only to cast a legendary spell. You can also tap it to add 1 mana of any color among legendary permanents you control. You can also pay 3, tap it, exile Plaza of Heroes, target legendary creature. Gains hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. Gives us the mana we need to cast our legendary creatures. Protects the legendary creatures. What more could you want? Tyrite Sanctum is a land that can tap for a colorless. You can also pay 2, tap it. Target legendary creature becomes a god in addition to its other types. Put a +1/+1 counter on it. You can also pay 4, tap it. Sacrifice Tyrite Sanctum. Put an indestructible counter on target god. Don't really care about that second part, but the ability to just go ahead and continue to put counters on things. Doesn't matter if they're a god or not, but just put more counters on legendary creatures. Rogue's Passage. It's a land. You can tap it to add a colorless. Pay 4, tap it, target creature can't be blocked this turn. Yep. Reliquary Tower. You have no maximum hand size. Once again, similar to Thought Vessel. We don't need a hand size because we're going to be drawing too many cards. You can also tap for a colorless. And now we're moving on to the lands that tap for our colors. Command Tower. You already know this one. Tap it. Add 1 mana of any color in your commander's color identity. Exotic Orchard, similarly, we talked about Felwar Stone. Same thing. Tap to add 1 mana of any color that a land an opponent could produce. Deathcap Glade is a land that enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or more other lands. You can tap for a black or green. Lanamore Wastes, a land. You can tap for a colorless or you can tap for a black or green. It deals 1 damage to you. Overgrown Tomb is the shock in our colors. It enters the battlefield. You may pay 2 life. If you don't, it enters tapped. You can tap for a black or green. It is a swamp forest. Undergrowth Stadium. It's our EDH land. That's right, the bond land. Undergrowth Stadium enters the battlefield tapped unless you have 2 or more opponents. Tap for a black or green. Woodland Cemetery enters the battlefield tapped unless you control a swamp or forest. Tap for a black or green. And finally, to add our basic land count, 12 basic forests and 8 basic swamps. And that is going to do it for our deck tech for Cleopatra Exiled Pharaoh. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't done so already. My final thoughts about this deck, as the +1/+1 counter guy, I love it. As you already know, being able to go ahead and draw so many cards because your creature's going to be huge. Yeah, it's really good. And our commander goes ahead and distributes those counters. And if our opponent had creatures that had counters, we draw cards for those dying. It's so good. But yeah, comment down below. What do you guys think of Cleopatra Exiled Pharoah. If you guys wanted to see this entire deck list, check the description down below. You go ahead and play test it yourself. Check out the entire list. Also, while you're down there, you can also check the links to our social media accounts. That's TikTok, that's Twitter, that's Instagram, that's at Guys at Magic for each one. Follow us on those as well to keep up to date with everything else that we got going on the screen right now. That's right. Those are all of our Patreon subscribers. Thank you guys so much for your added support. It really does mean the world to us. If you guys haven't already seen our Patreon and you want to check out what our Patreon subscribers are seeing that is not here on YouTube, check the link in the description as well and consider subscribing. And until the next video, hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Peace.